The kamikaze were not ancient warriors reborn. They were young men drafted into a strategy of desperation, created to delay defeat at any cost. By mid-1944, Japan's military position had become catastrophic. On June 19th and 20th, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 600 aircraft in a single engagement. The experienced naval air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor was gone. Weeks later, on July 9th, Saipan fell to American forces. B-29 bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. The empire was collapsing inward. On October 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in Manila to take command of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. He faced an impossible situation. American carriers were approaching, and Japan had neither the pilots nor the planes to stop them using conventional tactics. The next day, Onishi proposed something unprecedented. In his words, "In my opinion, there is only one way of assuring that our meager strength will be effective to a maximum degree. That is, to organize kamikaze attack units composed of fighter planes carrying 250-kilogram bombs, with each plane to crash dive into an enemy carrier." 5 days later, on October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first organized kamikaze attack during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His Shikishima unit dove into the American fleet off Samar. The escort carrier USS St. Lo erupted in flames and sank within minutes. These units were officially named Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, Special Attack Units, but they became known by another name, kamikaze, divine wind. The term invoked the typhoons that had scattered Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, storms interpreted as proof of Japan's sacred protection. Onishi's logic was brutally simple. Conventional tactics no longer worked. Sacrifice was Japan's last weapon. The kamikaze program didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built on foundations laid decades earlier. In 1882, the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors was issued. This document became the ethical core of Japan's armed forces, demanding absolute loyalty and obedience to the emperor. By the 1930s and 40s, this militarization had penetrated every level of Japanese education. State Shinto transformed Emperor Hirohito into more than a monarch. He became a living deity. Death in his service wasn't presented as tragedy. It was sacralized as the highest form of national duty. The ancient samurai code of Bushido was stripped down and weaponized. Originally emphasizing loyalty, martial valor, and honor, it was reinterpreted during the war to mean one thing: unhesitating self-sacrifice, death over surrender, always. Propaganda slogans reinforced this message relentlessly. 100 million die as a shattered jewel. Gyokusai promoted the idea that the entire nation should commit mass sacrifice rather than live in defeat. Wartime textbooks taught children, life is as light as a feather, duty as heavy as a mountain. The call for kamikaze pilots was officially framed as a volunteer system, a saigan, a solemn wish. But historian Emiko Onuki Tierney, who studied the diaries of student soldiers, noted the young pilots were not merely puppets. They made their decision within a social environment that provided them with no viable alternative to volunteering. Refusing meant public shame. It meant your family would be dishonored. It meant being sent to a remote front where death was guaranteed anyway, but without honor. One survivor described refusing as accepting a living hell. The system didn't need to force compliance. It made compliance the only psychologically survivable option. Training centers like Chiran and Tsukuba became factories of death. Between 1944 and 1945, they processed thousands of young men, most between 18 and 22 years old. Many were gakuto, student soldiers conscripted in the war's final desperate months. The typical recruit had fewer than 20 hours of flight experience. Training was compressed and surgical in its focus. Pilots learned takeoff. They learned a single high-altitude or low-altitude approach. They did not learn evasive maneuvers. They did not learn to land. Instructors repeatedly warned them, "Do not close your eyes on final approach." This wasn't poetry. It was a tactical necessity. Closing your eyes meant missing the target. Daily life at the bases blended minimal technical instruction with constant psychological preparation. Pilots wrote jisei, death poems. They posed for group photographs in their flight suits. They bowed to portraits of the emperor. Before their final missions, they received white hachimaki headbands signed by their comrades. They drank sake. They listened to patriotic music. At Chiran, there was a woman named Tomei Torihama, proprietress of the Tomiya Inn. The pilots called her the mother of the kamikaze. She provided them with warmth and comfort in their final days, a human connection before oblivion. The farewell letters reveal everything. Some accepted their fate with resignation. Ryoji Uehara, a 22-year-old student pilot, wrote to his parents in May 1945, "I am satisfied to have been born Japanese." But others betrayed quiet desperation. Captain Adachi Takuya wrote to his pregnant wife, "Until you've safely given birth to our child, I have no intention of dying easily. I will return without fail." He didn't return. Of the 1,036 Japanese Army aviators who died in kamikaze attacks during the Battle of Okinawa, 439 departed from Chiran Air Base. The first successful kamikaze attack proved Onishi's terrible mathematics. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, 93 conventional fighters and 57 bombers inflicted no damage on American carriers. But 6 kamikazes scored hits on 3 escort carriers. One carrier, the USS St. Lo, sank. Yet Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led that first mission, had privately expressed doubt. He told a friend, "Japan's future is bleak if it depends on the desperate death of its sons." By April 1945, kamikaze attacks had become routine. The Battle of Okinawa would see the largest sustained use of kamikaze tactics in history. Between April and June, Japan launched 9 massive waves of kamikaze attacks, the Kikusui operations. The first wave alone, on April 6th and 7th, committed 355 special attack planes. Approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties were flown during the campaign. Of these, an estimated 900 planes reached the target area. They achieved 182 direct hits and 97 damaging near misses. Pilots flew whatever was available. The Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's legendary fighter, now obsolete, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, and the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a rocket-powered piloted bomb the Americans grimly nicknamed Baka, Japanese for fool. For the U.S. Navy, Okinawa was unlike anything they had experienced. An American naval report stated the U.S. Navy absorbed a pounding unlike any it had ever experienced. 22 ships were sunk. 172 were damaged. Over 4,900 American sailors died, more than in any other naval campaign of the war. But the mathematics were brutal. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died. Most missions failed. Mechanical failure, poor weather, inexperience, anti-aircraft fire, combat air patrols. For every successful hit, multiple pilots died for nothing. The kamikaze inflicted real damage, but never enough to halt America's advance. The strategy could not alter the war's outcome. What it truly destroyed was an entire generation of Japan's youth. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For pilots awaiting their final missions, the moment was surreal. One survivor, Tezuka, was en route to his target when he heard the news. He later recalled, I had been all set to die. My mind went absolutely blank. The next day, August 16th, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi committed ritual sacrifice in Tokyo. His final note read, in part, "I want to offer a deep apology to the souls of the brave attackers and to their surviving families. I ask the people of Japan to work to prevent the ruin of our country that is now taking place." It was an admission. The architect of the program recognized what he had done. For the pilots who survived, those whose missions were cancelled, whose planes malfunctioned, who were still in training when the war ended, life became a different kind of ordeal. They faced a nation that no longer celebrated sacrifice. Japan's post-war pacifist identity left little room for warriors who had prepared to die for the emperor. Some felt betrayed by the leaders who had glorified their deaths. Others struggled silently with survivors' guilt and the psychological toll of having been primed for sacrifice. Survivor Tezuka reflected years later on the environment that had shaped him. There were no real options for refusal. In 1955, the Toko Kanondo Temple was established in Chiran, a goddess of mercy for the Special Attack Forces. 20 years later, in 1975, the Chiran Peace Museum for Kamikaze pilots opened its doors. Today, it preserves the letters, photographs, and personal effects of the pilots, not as propaganda, not as celebration, but as evidence, a stark reminder of how nationalism and indoctrination can weaponize youth. Modern historians have reframed the Kamikaze legacy. The pilots are no longer seen as fanatical zealots or glorious heroes. They are understood as victims, tragic casualties of a system that fused state Shinto, militarized education, and cultural coercion into a mechanism that made refusal psychologically impossible. Between 2,500 and 4,000 pilots died in kamikaze attacks. Thousands more were in training when the war ended. The kamikaze were not driven by madness or faith alone, but by a system that taught death was duty and obedience was honor. In the end, their story is not one of glory, but of tragedy,